My title for the presentation, Brain Science 101, but I've also said that another good title for this presentation might be that kids are stupid. So I want to start with some stories. I would like you to tell me some experiences of something stupid you did as a child or teenager. I'm sure that we've all got some stories. I'm looking for some experiences that as an adult you would probably never do, but even though it was stupid as a kid, you didn't realize that or you didn't think about it that way. Anybody have a story? Oh, right off the bat, we've got one.
We stole a telephone pole.
Wait, you stole a telephone pole?
Friends and I stole a telephone
Like a
pole.
giant pole that is, okay.
We stole a telephone pole and went and threw it in the lake and then swam in the middle of the night on this telephone pole.
That sounds awesome. I have a story about a telephone pole too, but it was not that cool. Who else has a story? Something dumb you did as a teenager. Anybody else have a story you want to tell? Here's mine. This is me. I was 15 years old at the time, and I thought I was a genius. And the reason that I thought I was a genius is because I had a great idea. You take this long rope and you climb to the top of a power line and you secure the rope at the top of that power line. And then you trail the rope all the way back down to the ground and you trail it out a certain distance from the pole. And right about the point that it meets the ground, you put a harness on the rope. And then if you get into that harness and you get a whole bunch of your friends on the end of the rope and they take off running with it, it will pull you up into the air really fast. And it's fun. We had this great idea. We thought this will be fun. And so we're doing this for a while. And after a while, we decided that we needed a little bit more than what we were getting out of this. Here's where my really great idea comes into play. I decided that since this group of friends wasn't pulling me up into the air fast enough, a really good idea would be to take the end of that rope and tie it to a four-wheeler. And then the four-wheeler could take off really fast, and that would pull me into the air a lot faster. And I still remember, as we're tying the rope onto the end of the four-wheeler, my dad walking up and saying, "This is a bad idea." And I said, "No, this is a genius idea." And he said, "No, I don't think that you should do this." And I said, "Oh, I think it's going to be great, and we're going to do this." And he was like, "All right, I'll let you figure out for yourself." So I get myself in the harness, and a friend takes off on this four-wheeler as fast as he can go, and it was a rush. It pulls you up into the air really fast. What I didn't consider is that at some point, the four-wheeler is going to hit the end of that rope, and it will stop very abruptly. But I'm already being thrown into the air really fast. And so when the rope stopped, I hit the rope and then flipped over it, and then the harness caught, and I came back down and hit the rope again, and it was very painful. And I remember hanging there thinking, this was probably a bad idea. What's interesting about this, though, is that you've got two people. I think it's a brilliant idea. My dad's standing there watching and saying, "It's not. This is a dumb idea." Both of us viewed this same thing very differently. He tried to tell me, I wouldn't listen. We might assume that it's simply because maybe he's got some life experience that would tell him, this probably isn't a good idea. And that might be the case. But we actually know now that our brains literally were functioning differently. We were looking at this exact same behavior, and our brains processed the information in a different way. They didn't function the same way. My prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain responsible for decision-making and rational thought and emotional control, was not even completely developed. If you put your hands together, make two fists, put them together, you will see a rough estimate of the size of your brain. It's not exact, but this is kind of a rough estimate of the size of your brain. This is why whenever Rowdy and his wife have an argument, he asks her to put her hands together like this, and then he puts his up there and he says, "See, mine's bigger, that's why I'm right." He tries it every time. It never works for him, but he keeps trying it. Scientists have been studying child development for millennia, and we're all familiar probably with various child development theories. Most of them suggest that kids go through various stages in their development, and most of them suggest that at some point in those early stages, kids are mimicking what they're seeing without fully understanding it. One of my favorite examples of this, I have this thing that I do with all of my nieces and nephews where at some point when they're in this early stage of development where they're mimicking without really understanding, I'll do this thing that makes their moms really mad. I'll find an object. It can be any object, but if it's roughly around this size, it will work. I give it to the child. I could get a remote. I've done this many times with a remote control. And I hand the child the remote, and what do? Why? This is not a phone. You cannot communicate with somebody through this device. So why is it that if I hand a child around this stage of development something that is around this shape and size, they automatically put it to their face and start making noises? It's what they see. They see people take objects roughly this size and put it to their face and make noises. They don't understand that they cannot communicate, that there's not somebody on the other end of the line here. They just know that this is what they see adults doing a lot, which is why it seems to make my sisters upset when I hand a child a remote and they put it to their face and then I turn to them and say, "How much time do you spend on the phone?" And it makes them really mad. I had an experience one time where I was talking, so my sister-in-law, they were taking their family to Disneyland, and they had a little toddler that was about this old, and they didn't want to take him to Disneyland because he was so young, and so they asked if he could stay with us for the week. So my wife and I are taking care of him for the week, and at some point, she calls to check on him. And so it was really funny because I'm talking to her on the phone. He's crawling across the floor, and he looks up and sees me talking to her on the phone, and so he reaches over and grabs the remote control and puts it up over his eye and starts making noises. He didn't have language yet. He didn't have any words, so he just puts the remote up and starts making these little weird noises. And so, not wanting the opportunity to go by, I actually turned it to a video call so I could show her son doing this, and then I asked her how often she talks on the phone that he's developed this. Another favorite example that I have is with another nephew. And I was with he and his dad at a Brewers baseball game in Milwaukee one time. And so we're sitting in the stadium, and we can see in the distance there is this storm that's kind of making its way toward us. And my nephew was, I don't know how old he was, maybe 4 or 5 years old at the time. And his dad and I are kind of keeping an eye on this storm because we can see it slowly moving this way. We're wondering if it's going to result in the game getting canceled or something like that. And so we've been talking about it. This little nephew of mine, he's sitting between us, and he's just so excited to be here at this baseball game. He loved baseball, and he got really excited anytime we went to a game. And so he's sitting between us, and he's hearing us talk about this storm, but he's not really interested in it. He's interested in the ball game. And so even though I think some of this is getting through to him, he just wasn't paying that close attention. Until all of a sudden, at one point, as the storm is coming towards us, it's getting a little closer, and my brother-in-law looks out at the dark clouds, and he said, "Wow, it's really raining cats and dogs out there." And it was really funny. This little 4 or 5-year-old kid looks up at his dad, and then he looks up at me, and I said something like, "Yeah, it really is." And then he climbs up on his chair, and he's like straining to look out over the top of the stadium at this storm in the distance. And he was really confused. He keeps looking back and forth between the two of us. Why? Yeah. In his brain, the way that he processed this information is that my dad just said cats and dogs are falling from the sky. And he was very interested in that and confused when he doesn't see cats and dogs falling from the sky. The reason is because he had not yet developed abstract thinking. It's interesting, there is a hierarchy of brain functioning. First and foremost, the brain takes care of the most immediate needs of the body. It keeps our temperature regulated, our heart rate consistent, our blood pressure, what it needs to be. And then after that, it starts taking care of things like energy and sleep and appetite. These functions of the brain begin to develop in utero, so that when a baby is born, the brain can already do most of those things. But it takes a while for those other things like motor regulation, to begin to develop. And guess what the very, very last brain function to develop is? Abstract thinking. That's the very last thing. That's the reason why this little kid was confused at that phrase, raining cats and dogs. This is the reason why when my dad and I looked at this exact same activity, one of us thought it's a genius idea, and one of us realized this is not going to end well. So I want to give you a crash course on brain science, but rather than spending an hour doing that, I'm going to show you a video that in about 6 minutes is going to give you a 1-hour lecture on brain science. What that means is that we're going to condense it and we're going to get it over really fast, but it's going to happen fast. So you're going to have to pay attention and stay with me. But this is, I'm going to introduce you. Some of you might be familiar with Hank Green, who has a YouTube channel where he runs the SciShow. And so he's going to take all this science about brain development and he's going to sum it up in this video. So I'll play it. Pay close attention, and when it's done, we'll talk about it a little bit more.
Being a teenager is hard, and so is living with one, I'm told. No human gets to escape this moody, angsty, confusing phase, and interestingly, such an extended adolescence is unique to humans. Other animals grow up a lot faster than we do. And you may think our teen years are just about streamlining bodies for baby making, but as it turns out, the storms of sex hormones that we associate with the teenage years are only a small part of what's really going on in the teenage body. Most of the action, it turns out, is happening in the brain. Until fairly recently, we thought that the brain finished the nuts and bolts of its development by the time we started kindergarten. But really, right as puberty rolls in, it undergoes massive remodeling. This amounts to several years of neural growing pains, as well as the other, more visible growth that's going on all over your body. So take heart, whether you're going through it now, are about to go through it, or count yourself among the veterans of that turbulent decade. Know that the result of the teen years is a stronger, faster, more sophisticated brain. Or someone had told me that 20 years ago. Let's start with that obvious scapegoat of adolescent anguish, hormones. That word itself is kind of a lazy shorthand that people use to describe the chemicals that some of our glands excrete that can affect our behavior. But the fact is, hormones have all kinds of jobs that have nothing to do with where you grow hair, or what turns you on, or whether you feel glum for no apparent reason. Hormones keep your heart beating and your body hydrated, and they make your organs grow and make you grow bone and muscle and skin. What people actually mean when they talk about teenage hormones are sex hormones. And yes, puberty involves a whole series of sex hormone storms, the first of which actually kicks in before you're out of primary school. That's when the adrenal glands start secreting androgens, which trigger the growth and activity of the skin's sebaceous glands, making the skin more oily. Soon enough, more apocrine or sweat glands get activated, increasing body odor. Then comes the wave of hormonal agents that start activating the gonads. For boys, this influx of luteinizing hormones from the pituitary gland get testosterone brewing in the testes, and suddenly, that guy has up to 50 times more testosterone than he did before puberty. This also changes the shape of the male body, promoting hair growth and building up lean muscle mass, just as the increased presence of estrogen in girls rearranges the deposition of their fat, stimulating the growth of breasts. Humans are actually lucky to experience the craziness of puberty only once. Many other animals undergo multiple similarly intense hormonal rodeos as they enter sexually active periods, sometimes called the rut or heat, every new breeding season. Some male species completely stop eating during their breeding period because they're just that sex crazed. And yet, all that said, teens are far less ruled than their hormones than you might think. There are other other factors at play here. For example, your favorite moody teen may be by turns punchy, angry, depressed, or in a zombie-like fog because of their chronic lack of sleep. Sleep is vital to everyone, but it's especially important for kids and teens because it's during sleep that your pituitary gland releases an essential growth hormone necessary for development. A normal sleep cycle driven by circadian rhythm is regulated by the daytime release of cortisol, which helps you wake up, and melatonin, which helps you wind down when it gets dark. But this biology of sleep timing changes as we age, and as puberty begins, teens' sleep clocks get pushed back. Most adults start oozing melatonin around 10 p.m.-ish, but one study showed that teenagers don't start producing melatonin until closer to 1 a.m. This may be because puberty's hormonal frenzy is stalling the release of melatonin, and could partly explain why so many teens stay up late energized by the night, but have a really hard time rolling out of bed with the alarm. Of course, it's a bit of a chicken and egg deal, since watching reruns of The Simpsons and playing Call of Duty late into the night continues to stimulate the brain, which may further delay the release of melatonin. Still, some researchers are starting to advocate for pushing back high school start times in the morning in the hopes of having more focused students. So we got sex hormones changing the bodies and a lack of sleep to contend with, but increasing evidence suggests that there is something much bigger at work that's making teenagers so teenagery. Their brains. It turns out that brains actually take longer than we thought to fully mature. I don't mean physical size. Our brains are already about 95% full size by the time we're just 6, but more in the sense of the connections inside the brain. Adults, for the most part, know how to make decisions by evaluating choices and weighing consequences. They do this with their prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for controlling impulses and emotions and forming judgments. Its neurons chat with the neurons in other regions of the brain responsible for, say, memory or movement through synapses. Thing is, teenage brains don't quite work like this yet. The prefrontal cortex may not be fully developed until your mid-20s, and teen synapses, those lines of communication, are still growing and specializing. They're also slow. As an adolescent brain keeps developing, its axons, the long tail-like parts of the neurons that transmit signals to other neurons, become more and more insulated by a fatty layer called the myelin sheath. This padding greatly increases the cell's transmission speed, and while it helps adults make faster decisions, it isn't fully formed in teens. These changes occur slowly, beginning at the back of the brain where the oldest and most fundamental brain parts reside, and slowly working its way forward to the more advanced and complicated brain bits. The prefrontal cortex is the last to be hooked up and shaped. So it's important to keep in mind that just because your favorite teenagers stayed up until sunrise binge-watching The Walking Dead the night before an exam, it doesn't mean they're dumb or lazy. Their brains are just literally finishing being built. But at the same time, because all this brain building is just starting to peak, this is also when the brain starts getting thinned out. You actually start losing connections that you don't use enough in a process called synaptic pruning, which has led to a theory that this is kind of a use it or lose it phase. Meaning, adolescence could be an especially important time to use your brain. Play an instrument, engage in sports, write poetry, learn a language. Because by doing these things, you're helping hardwire those synapses and giving your brain topiary a lovely, lasting shape. Whereas if you're sitting around all day playing Candy Crush, those will be the connections that survive, which you don't need. This shaping of the teen brain manifests itself in other ways too, like in teenage attitudes. A group of scientists at the McLean Hospital in Massachusetts once hooked up a group of adults and a group of teens to MRI devices and then asked them to identify a series of expressions on photographs of adult faces. Interestingly, while adults correctly identified one expression as fear, the teenagers thought the faces showed anger, surprise, or shock. They weren't registering subtlety as well. Not only that, but the MRI images showed that adults and teens responded with different parts of their brains. Adults used the reasonable prefrontal cortex, while the teens mostly used the gut reaction emotional amygdala, located farther back in the brain. Results like these might help explain why teenagers seem to experience frequent mood swings. For one, they tend to react quickly from the emotional part of their brain without running those reactions by the more rational frontal cortex, and two, it could be that they're just misreading expressions and therefore the intentions behind them. The frontal cortex also helps people relate to and understand each other, and you can imagine what happens when concern is misjudged as anger or worry as disappointment. The Fresh Prince has an entire song about it. But the truth is, as much as parents just don't understand, teens don't always understand either. When the emotional amygdala and the more rational cortex aren't fully hooked up yet, that can make it hard for teenagers to productively work through emotions. This kind of reactionary, impulsive behavior may also lead to more risk-taking. Adolescence is the time when we're most likely likely to experiment with whatever booze, drugs, or toad licking is available, and unfortunately, it's also the time our developing brains are most vulnerable to lasting effects. Studies have shown that teens are more likely to become addicted to drugs and alcohol than adults, partly because their brains are more attuned to their reward centers. While the teenage prefrontal cortex is still developing, their nucleus accumbens, or pleasure and reward zone, forms early on. Neuroimaging studies have shown that when presented with a big potential reward, teen brains light up way more than kids' or adults' brains. But if the reward was small, teen brains hardly fired at all. So basically, give an adolescent a pat on the back, and you'll get a shrug. Give them a hot date or a winning goal, and their brains light up like Vegas. This, of course, does not always result in great judgment. A jacked up, thrill-seeking impulse combined with an exquisite pang of peer pressure, plus a new driver's license, new sex parts, and access to substances can lead to some not good results. But still, this long and sometimes tedious remodeling process that our bodies go through in the teenage years isn't all bad. Many scientists have pointed out that our delayed adolescence lets our brains keep their flexibility longer, which, yeah, may make teens a little slow, but also more adaptable as they prepare for the adult world. In this way, you can see teen impulsiveness as boldness or independent thinking, and moodiness as a source of newfound empathy, and excitability as passion. Which means there's a lot of awesome energy floating around out there ready to decrease all kinds of world suck. Thanks for watching.
All right, I know that was a lot of information to be thrown at you in 6 minutes, but it also summarized a 1-hour presentation on brain science into 6 minutes. And essentially, what Hank is saying here is that we know that the gray matter does not fully form until after the age of 25. I told you the other day that there's new research out of Harvard suggesting it might actually be 27 or 28 before that gray matter is fully formed, which means prior to that time, our brain is still under construction. The gray matter is still forming. Pruning is still taking place. Neural pathways are being developed. And anything that we do to the brain during those developmental times is going to have a big impact or a bigger impact on functioning. I mentioned the other day that this is one of the reasons why kids seem to be so much more adept at learning new skills. They learn how to ride a bike very quickly. Has anybody ever tried, or do you know somebody who never learned to ride a bike and then as an adult tried to develop that skill? It's very difficult. For some reason, little kids pick that up very quickly, but as adults, that's really difficult to develop. Playing an instrument, much more difficult. It's not that you can't learn a new instrument as an adult, but it doesn't happen nearly as quickly as it does when you're doing that as a child. I talked about language. It's really interesting. We offer English as a second language for kids who are coming here and going to school and their first language is not English. And we actually have specific instruction and special classes to help them learn that new language. But for very young kids, we don't put them in ESL classes. My wife is a kindergarten teacher. She doesn't have students that go into ESL. That's not a thing in kindergarten. The reason is because they just develop language very quickly. In fact, this has happened a number of times where my wife has had students who have shown up to they've come into the United States like the day before school started, and so their first day in kindergarten is the first time that they are being exposed to this new language. A couple of years ago, she had a student who had just arrived from India the night before, and then the next morning, he's showing up to his very first day of public school. And he spoke no English whatsoever, not a single word of English. It was about 3 months later that I was in her classroom helping her one afternoon, and I asked her about this student, and I said, how's he doing? And she said, well, why don't you see if you can identify this student? So I'm walking around the classroom talking to all these different students, seeing if I can figure out which one is the one who 3 months prior didn't speak any English. And it took me 5 guesses to get the right one. He had developed language so quickly and spoke so well that I never would have guessed that 3 months prior to this, he didn't speak the language. The reason is because he was in one of these peaks of brain development. Because we can now scan the brain, we're able to see development as it happens. So scientists have found these 2 major peaks of development that occur after birth, followed by two more but less intense periods of development. And so those two peaks are associated with development or programming or encoding, or we might use the word wiring, of new capacities. So you can see that between the age of 2 and 3 years old, so throughout this whole entire phase, we're at really high levels of development. But then even within this, there are these stages where that development just really skyrockets even more. The next one, about 6 years later, happens around 14 or 15 years old, and then slowly starts to come back down again. We're still at really high levels up to around 24 years old, and then that's when it really starts to taper off. And after that, the gray matter becomes fully formed. Most pruning has taken place at that point, and so development really slows down. This is also one of the reasons why we get really concerned about what happens to kids in these early stages of development. We know that trauma, for example, is going to be far more impacting on their mental health. We know that substance use is going to have much more of an impact on their developing brain. I showed you some of these spectral images where we could actually look at some of the impacts of early substance use on brain development and how it impacts the brain. So the gist of all of this is that early prevention, and specifically focusing on primary prevention and universal strategies, becomes really, really important. We call this the continuum of care, which just shows this whole continuum of making sure that people are healthy and safe. All of this right here, promoting good health and preventing problem behaviors, is our focus in health promotion and prevention. Trying to prevent the need of needing treatment and recovery services later on. Because what the research shows, this is research from Columbia University, which demonstrates that if a child gets to the age of 21 without smoking, drinking, or using illegal drugs, she is virtually certain never to do so. It's very rare that people who have never used substances by the time they get into their early 20s then decide to start using substances. And if they do, it's even more rare that at that point they're going to quickly develop a dependency or an addiction. So, our goal is to very early on promote healthy behaviors and prevent those really dangerous, harmful behaviors. Because, as I showed you the other day, this is the reason why researchers like Dr. Madras say that prevention is not a war on drugs. It is a defense of our brains. Our whole purpose is to keep kids healthy. There you go. Hour-and-a-half presentation on brain science. We did it in 30 minutes. Well, mostly Hank did it. But. Questions? Thoughts? All right, our next topic is coalitions and collaboration. And to kick off this presentation, for those of you who know Heidi, you know that she loves superheroes. And so I did this specifically for Heidi. I'm going to show you, hopefully it's not too much, but I'm going to show you a 5-minute clip from an Avengers movies. You guys know the Avengers? Have you seen these movies? If not, this is going to be a little bit of a spoiler for you because I'm going to play about 5 minutes towards the end of the first Avengers movie. And then we'll come back and talk about it toward the end of the presentation.
Dr. Banner, now might be a really good time for you to get angry.
That's my secret, Cap. I'm always angry.
Call it, Captain.
All right, listen up. Until we can close that portal, our priority is containment. Barton, I want you on that roof. Eyes on everything. Call out patterns and strays. Stark, you got the perimeter. Anything gets more than 3 blocks out, you turn it back or you turn it to ash.
Can you give me a lift?
Right. Better clench up, Legolas.
Thor, you gotta try and bottleneck that portal. Slow him down. You got the lightning. Light the bastards up. You and me, we stay here on the ground. We keep the fighting here. And Hulk. Smash.
This was a seminal moment in the movie because prior to this, what you see happening here was not happening. Back in 1983, there was a wise and sage philosopher by the name of Robert Matthew Van Winkle from Florida who issued advice that I think has become pure direction for successful partnerships. In fact, I think that it was meant for coalition work. It's helped guide me from the start of my ventures into coalition work. Philosopher Van Winkle, as he's known in some circles, gave this prophetic advice.
All right, stop, collaborate and listen.
That's not what you expected, was it? Sorry. It's not just a recommendation for Van Winkle's wardrobe and hair. It's something that applies to most of us as coalition workers. Many of you work in public health. Some of you are working with different community agencies where prevention and public health is going to be your focus. And I'm assuming that all of us want to be involved in making our communities safer and healthier places, which is why you got involved in this work. It's why you probably were willing to give up 3 days of your time to come to a training like this. Some of you might even be volunteers working with your local community coalitions or agencies. So obviously, money isn't your motivation. Prestige and fame can't be it. When it comes to fame, the very most that you can hope for is a misquote in your local newspaper. I make that joke because it was a couple of years ago that a colleague of ours was really involved in some prevention work, and as a result, people were upset, and so it got some news attention. And a quote actually got printed in the local newspaper of somebody who was upset at the prevention work that he was doing, actually calling him this. That's what got printed in the paper. And so that's the reason that I point out that if you're looking for fame, this is probably the notoriety that you're going to end up with in this particular occupation. The point is, money and fame are not the motivating factors for probably any of us. It tends to be passion for positive change. You like contributing to a better community. And because of that, we get excited about the work that we do. We get protective of the work that we do. And because of that, I think too often we try to do it all ourselves. Many of you can get away with that for a long time. Some of us have gotten away with it for a long time. You're really good at juggling a million different items and keeping everything in the air. But eventually, as it did with the Cat in the Hat, things tend to come crashing down. Or at the very least, we're not being as effective as we could be. And at the very most, we're not involving and engaging our community, which is why I think that Vanilla Ice's command is appropriate for us as coalition workers. When we're trying to create community change, we need to pump the brakes, we need to stop and make sure that we're doing everything that we can to collaborate with all of the people that should be involved in this.
Collaborate.
Which is his next piece of advice, collaboration. When I was 20, I told you the other day that I was living in the country of Ecuador, and I got to be a part of a really cool project that I used as an example when we were talking about the public health model. And I want to expound on that now. Ecuador is a country that sits on the western coast of South America. So you can see that it has the country of Colombia to the north, you've got Peru to the east and the south, and right down here is the country of Chile. You have the Andes mountain range that runs right through the center of the country. So everything on the west of the mountains of the Andes is this coastal area of the country, and everything that is on the east of the Andes is Amazon jungle. It's a little bit different now. It's made a lot of progress in the last 20 years since I was there. But when I was living there in 2000, over 50% of the population lived below the poverty line, which is what this map shows. This shows you portions of the country. Wherever you see that dark red, those are portions of the country where over 90% of the population live below the poverty line. If you can imagine that. There's not very many places in the communities that we live where you probably have even 90% of a neighborhood living below the poverty line. But all of those red areas are places where 90% of people are living below the poverty line. And also understand that the poverty threshold in Ecuador is defined very differently than it is here in the United States. You can see that I have identified this town that is called Ventanas, and you can see that it is one of those places on the map where 90% of the population are living below the poverty line. It rains almost every day during the rainy season. I talked the other day about how because of this, a lot of times people have to build their cane shacks up on stilts because it will flood, sometimes for weeks or months at a time, that they're just living over swamps. And Ventanas is a town that sits right at the base of those Andes mountains, which border the Amazon jungle. And much of the population lives just outside of the city center in large neighborhoods like this. And in these areas of the country, the major health risk, as I mentioned the other day, is dengue hemorrhagic fever, which is contracted by mosquitoes. And it's a rampant problem in these communities. We talked about the other day how there is no running water in most of these neighborhoods. So in order for them to get drinking water and cooking water and cleaning water, they go into the backyard, they dig a hole, and that hole fills up with water. So you end up with these standing water wells throughout the neighborhoods that also become breeding grounds for mosquitoes. But we talked about the good news. Environmental scientists discovered that if you can treat those standing water wells with even just a quarter cup of Clorox, it can kill anywhere from 50 to 90% of the mosquitoes that are living there. But here's the problem. There's a lot of barriers that exist in getting this kind of a strategy implemented. We've got some good science here. The research shows a really good preventative strategy would be to go put Clorox in these standing water wells. Easier said than done, though. It's good data. We know that it would work if we could do it, but how do you do that? That's a really big endeavor to try and treat maybe thousands of these water wells in just one community. The vice mayor of the town, after she got this initial research, decided that she wanted to implement this strategy, and she tried and she failed. She realized that this was not a job that she could do by herself, and that's how I got involved. She decided to enlist a whole bunch of different groups to help her get this project done. The first thing that she did was turn the project over to the city manager. She asked him to organize it. She hired the environmental scientists to come in and figure out exactly how much Clorox was going to be needed in the average well in the town of Ventanas to kill the mosquitoes. She then got a group of local business owners together who agreed to finance this project, which included purchasing the Clorox as well as little baggies to put the Clorox in. She found a local youth group who was willing to get together and fill all these little baggies with a quarter cup of the Clorox. And then she sent city employees out into the community to put the Clorox in the wells. And it didn't work. Can you guess why maybe in communities like this, city employees weren't very successful at getting Clorox into the wells? These people are very impoverished, and they don't have very much faith in their local government. And when a city employee shows up dressed nice and knocks on the sheet that they're using for their front door and says, hey, we want to pour a chemical in your water out back, they say, So, at first she thought, well, we need to educate people about this. We need to create some pamphlets. We'll go out and paper these flyers throughout the community. It'll explain what we're doing, and then people will be a little bit more willing. But I mentioned the other day, that didn't work because a significant number of people living in these neighborhoods can't read. If they can, they might not speak the specific language that the flyers were in. And you still run into the same thing. Partly as a result of their poverty levels, there is this really high mistrust of anything that the government tells them. So even when the government decided they wanted to help and they had something that they felt like would really improve the health and safety of the community, it just wasn't working. And that's when I got involved. At the time, I was a missionary for a church. That's the reason that I was living in Ventanas. And the vice mayor realized, hey, these people are out walking through these neighborhoods all the time. The people know them. The people invite them into their houses. They know that they are not employees of the government. I had actually approached her a couple of months prior to this because a big part of what we did as missionaries was community service. And so I had reached out to her and said, hey, we're available. If you have anything that we could do to help in the community, let us know. And at the time she didn't. But a few months later, after she had been failing with this project, she had that idea. And so she called me up and asked if I would come and meet with her. And she said, here's what we're trying to do. She actually showed me the science that the environmental scientists had been gathering. And she said, we think that we could make a difference with this. We have a really good team of people that are together and helping us. We just need that one last thing, people to help us get the Clorox into the wells. And so we got a big contingent of these missionaries in the area. They were from all over the place, from the United States, from South America, right there from the country of Ecuador. In fact, in this picture, you probably can't see it very well, but this is my friend Derek from Wyoming, and this is Carlos, who is actually from northern Ecuador. And you can't see it very well, but Derek is holding a bag here that is filled with all of these little baggies that have a quarter cup of Clorox. And we spent about 5 weeks walking around through all of these neighborhoods and explaining to people what we were doing and asking if they would be okay if we went out and put a cup of Clorox into their ground well. In the 5 weeks that we were doing this, I think there was one person who told me no. They were very open to us coming by in our shorts and t-shirts and telling them what we were doing, and they would say, yeah, come on. They would walk us through the shack and out into the backyard and point to the well, and we would go pour the Clorox into it, and they were totally fine with that. I think of all of the people that we had helping with this over those 5 weeks, there was only about a dozen households that didn't let us come in and put the Clorox in the well. You also can't see it in this image, but this really nice Fox t-shirt that my girlfriend had sent me not very long before this, it it's totally ruined because I had been carrying this big barrel of Clorox so that as we ran out of the baggies that were filled, we would stop and refill them. And so I'd been carrying around this thing of Clorox and it was leaking. And so my shirt is completely ruined. And I remember when I sent this picture back to my girlfriend, she was like, I just sent you that shirt. What have you done to it? Anyway. As I told you the other day, 6 months after... Sorry, we're getting there. 6 months after we did this project, the environmental scientists came back and the amount of dengue outbreaks in this community had dropped by 67%, by almost 70% because of this project. But the reason I chose this example right now is because it was probably the first experience that I ever had working on a collaborative effort for a community level change. And so I use this when I'm talking about the public health model, but it's also a great example of collaboration.
Alright, stop, collaborate and listen.
Which is why I think it applies really well to this idea, because as we talked about before, our communities are different. What needs to happen to prevent problems in St. George, Utah is very different than what we might need to do in inner city Chicago. And what I do in St. George, Utah is probably different than what I need to do in Hilldale, Utah. And that's the reason why we've decided in prevention we should focus our efforts on coalitions. We should go into a community and get people from that community to get together and figure out a way to solve their problems. It was only because Vice Mayor Ramirez knew of all of these different groups in the community that she was able to bring them together and to figure out what will work here, what specifically needs to happen here to get community members to be open to us getting this program implemented. So the very idea of a coalition is to bring all of these different sectors from the community. And depending on the community, you're going to have different sectors. Our representation here at the university looks different than this, but you've still done the same thing, right? You've reached out to all of these different departments and entities at the university and brought them together so that you have connection to all the different groups in the community, and you can actually figure out what needs to happen here, and then they can work together on a strategy. One of my favorite examples of this is the very first time that I ever tried to do a prescription drug take-back event, which we've talked about a couple of times so far. We had this strategy, right? We have some data that tells us that a lot of kids are using prescription drugs. We also have really good data that tells us that one of the reasons is because they're easily accessible to them. They can just go to a medicine cabinet in their own home and get them. So we've got a great solution. Here's our strategy. Let's do an event where we encourage the community to either lock up their medications or get rid of the ones that they don't have. If 70% of kids who are abusing prescription drugs get them from a medicine cabinet, do you see that we could reduce the supply for 70% of users by just locking up those cabinets or getting rid of the drugs? Without even going in and doing individual programming and trying to convince kids that they shouldn't use prescription drugs, we could cut off 70% of the users just by making their supply go away. But that's easier said than done, which is what we realized. The very first time I ever did one of these events, we were really naive about it. We did all this advertisement. So the first thing that we did is we went to some local businesses and we said, would you let us use your parking lot to do one of these events? And the businesses said, yeah, you bet. We got our youth coalitions involved and we had them go out and do advertisements. We printed these flyers and they went and put them up everywhere. They went into gas stations, they put them up on power poles, they went to all these businesses and put them up on their bulletin boards. So we were really getting the word out there. We printed up specific flyers that we sent to religious congregations in our community. And we said, would you announce this to your congregations? Let them know that we're going to do this event. And it worked really well. The event was scheduled to go from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. It was a 4-hour period where people could pull into this parking lot at a local business, and they didn't even have to get out of their car. They could just drive up, roll their window down, and hand over any prescription drugs that they wanted to get rid of. I had a member of our local drug task force that was helping me with this. And I've got a picture, I should have put it in here, but I have a picture of us at 9:45, 15 minutes before the event was even supposed to start. We had set up a table and a little canopy, and on that table, you see about 8 garbage bags full of prescription medications. Because people started showing up at 9:30 as we were just setting up our tables. Underneath the table, there are more garbage bags. I think we had a total of almost 15 bags just full of prescription drugs, and we haven't even started the event yet. And I'm bringing the next bag of prescription drugs that somebody had just brought in, and I walk over and I'm setting it down, and that detective from the drug task force is standing there, and he's just looking at all of these drugs. And I said, you know, if somebody driving by decides this would be a really easy way to get a whole bunch of valuable prescription drugs, we're really in a vulnerable position here. And because I had said that just out of curiosity, he was like, let's see what's in this bag. And so he opened the one that had just been dropped off, and there were 15 bottles of Loratab in them. We went through that bag, we decided the street value of those drugs that had been dropped off was well over $40,000, just in that one bag. And we realized this is probably not the best idea. We should have thought this through a little bit more. So the next time, we decided to be more prepared. We realized we need a lot more help, first of all. So we went to the coalition and we said, we need you to come and be there. We need a lot of people to help us do this. We also want to gather some more information. So we want to do surveys with people, figure out how did they hear about this, what motivated them to participate, so we can figure out how to do it better in the future. But we also realized we need law enforcement officers to be there and help us with this and make sure that we're protected. So I went to the local police department and said, hey, we're going to do another one of these. Could you give us 4 police officers to just come and be at the event and have a presence there? And the chief of police said, no, I don't have 4 officers that I can spare for you. And I said, well, but it's a really good event. Let me explain it. So I gave him more information, and he was just like, no, I can't do this. I don't have any officers that I can spare. So I thought, all right, that's fine. Maybe I'll go to the county sheriff's department, see if they can help. So I went to the sheriff. He explained what we were doing, and the sheriff said, I'm sorry, we just don't have the people that can help you with this. So we were really frustrated. We're actually thinking we probably are going to have to just cancel this event, because unless we can get some police presence, it's probably not safe to do this, especially since this time we're going to be bringing in a lot of volunteer coalition members as well. And I happened to be in a meeting with the mayor for something else. And the mayor was asking me how things were going and what kind of things we were doing. And I happened to tell him, well, we were going to do this prescription drug take-back event. I said we did one. We gathered 352 pounds of medications during that 4-hour period. And I said we'd love to do another one, but we realized we can't do it without law enforcement help. And he was like, well, get law enforcement help. And I said, well, I've been trying, but I can't get anybody to do it. And he said, who did you ask? And I said, well, I asked the chief. The chief works for the mayor, right? The mayor is the chief's boss. I said, I asked the chief, but he couldn't do it. And the mayor just smiled, reached over and picked up his phone, made a phone call right there. And I hear him say, Chief, I'm sitting here with Logan Reed. He's talking about this prescription drug take-back event that's coming up, and I would like to have a few officers there to help them. And I hear the chief on the other end say, oh yeah, great, we could do that. And the mayor says, how many do you need? And I was like, just as a joke, I said 10. And he's like, we need 10 officers there on this date. And the chief was like, great, we can do that. And I was like, oh, I was just joking. I didn't think that was going to be a real thing. So the mayor said, I'm sorry that it's been difficult for you to get this. And I said, yeah, I went to the sheriff too, and the sheriff told me no. And the mayor said, oh, watch this. And he dialed another number. He called a county commissioner. He said, I'm sitting here with Logan Reed. This is what we're dealing with. We're wondering if we get a few sheriff's deputies to help out with this. And the commissioner says, oh, yeah. He calls back 5 minutes later and says, we'll have 4 sheriff's deputies there for you as well. So the next time we did this, we ended up with just like an army of police officers that were sitting around with nothing to do. And eventually we figured out what the right amount would be. But my point is, this is the whole benefit of coalitions. You get these key people in your community who can help you get the other people that you need. When I couldn't get the police officers, the mayor and the county commissioner helped me do that, which is why all of these different sectors in the community become really important and really, really valuable. And when you can get that, when you put together a group like this that can actually, through the research, identify what to focus on and what strategies might impact those root causes or those risk and protective factors, you end up being able to track specific change. Remember our logic models that I've gone through so many times. Youth are consuming alcohol. That's a problem we've identified. Why? Well, it's very available and there's a low perception of risk. What's one of the reasons that it's available? There's a lack of enforcement. Maybe police officers aren't going out and addressing this issue. So we come up with a strategy, and it involves a lot of different people. It involved people from the retail industry so we could advertise this and let them know what was going to happen. We needed city government to get involved so that they would be willing to help us issue the ordinances or the citations or the fines that come with non-compliance. Of course, we have to have police officers involved to go in and do the compliance checks. We've got to have a youth group who will help find some underage buyers for us that we can train and have help with this project. And then we can start tracking exactly what we do with this, which is really great to report back to the parties that are interested. We can show them, look, we're doing something. We've checked 383 different retailers. We had 6 different police agencies helping us with this. They did 10 different patrols for these shoulder tap stings, over a total of 287 approaches and 17 arrests. We also sent these groups of 5-hour patrols out where they would specifically look for underage alcohol parties. And through a series of all of these, made a total of 165 arrests or citations. And remember, the point of this was to address this particular issue, this perception of risk, which was really low. We're trying to bring it up, let people realize there's some danger or some harm or some negative consequences that follow this. And this leads specifically to results. We first started this in 2009. In 2009, we asked kids, if we asked you to go out and get some alcohol, how easy would it be for you to do that? 40% of them almost said that would be really easy. We could go and do that right now if we needed to. After implementing all of these strategies that I just told you about for a few years, that dropped down below 30%. Kids reported it's not as easy for us to get alcohol anymore. It might be because a lot of them were getting in trouble going to parties where there was alcohol. They were getting citations. Local retailers who had been selling to minors were now getting arrested for it. People who were going in and purchasing alcohol and bringing it out to minors are now getting cited for it. And because the coalition was involved, we've got all of these people taking this information back to their individual agencies and telling them what we're doing. We had media personnel that were doing news stories on this. So the community was hearing, hey, police are cracking down on this. You might want to be a little bit more careful about drinking underage. And our overall goal was to reduce the number of kids who were consuming alcohol in the community, which is exactly what happened. The number of kids reporting lifetime use of alcohol dropped pretty significantly, which was also seen here with those who were drinking on a regular basis. We also saw a pretty significant reduction in the number of kids who reported drinking and driving, binge drinking, drinking and driving, riding with a drunk driver, or qualifying for needing alcohol treatment. And all of this was a result of changes in how accessible or available alcohol was to kids. In 2009, 10% of them said we get alcohol by going in and buying it from a retailer. 40% of them said that at some point they had paid somebody else who was 21 or older to go in and buy it for them. 62% of them said they got it at a party. And remember, there was that 31% that were saying it's not even risky to binge drink twice a week. Kids are saying it's okay to binge alcohol twice a week. And after implementing all of these strategies, we saw huge reductions. Kids were reporting, we're not getting it from retailers anymore. They won't sell it to us. It's more difficult to pay somebody to go and do it. That had dropped by like 30%. We saw a 10% reduction in the number of kids who were even getting alcohol at a party. And this dropped by almost 50%. It was through this collaboration with a community partner. None of these strategies that I just mentioned were something that I could do as a prevention specialist in my community. We had to have all of these different people involved in order to be able to get this strategy out, implemented. We've talked a couple of times about the Communities That Care model, which is just a system or a model that empowers communities to use this science that we've been talking about in their prevention efforts. All they do is they take that strategic prevention framework and they give you specific tools and strategies that you can use to implement that with a coalition, to build a coalition, get those key leaders that need to be involved and all of those other sectors that need to be represented, and get organized. You'll hear me talk quite a bit about Communities That Care. As I said yesterday with action planning, my opinion is that CTC is not the only way to do this. In fact, there are quite a few models that you could use to build a coalition and then follow that strategic prevention framework. CTC is not the only way, and it's not necessarily a perfect model. But you'll also hear me say that it's a very, very good one. In fact, it might be the most research-based model that we have. Some of the research that I like to show is this original study that was done when the model was very first created. And you can see that Utah was actually one of the states that was included in this study. What they did is they went into 7 different states. They identified communities that were very similar to each other, and in one of them they said, keep doing whatever you're doing. If you're doing prevention services, keep doing that, use whatever model you want. In the other community, they went in and said, we're going to give you CTC. We're going to help you implement this model and build a coalition using this particular system. And then they followed them for 5 years initially, but they kept it going longer even after that. And what they found is that the communities, all the communities were doing prevention of some kind. But the ones that were using this particular model had about a 35% reduction in their youth substance use rates. They saw reductions in delinquency and teen violence. They saw reductions in teen pregnancy. They saw reductions in depression and suicide. More so than in the other communities that weren't using this particular model. And the model is all about getting communities to build a group and have them start to collaborate. Have them start to work together on what they're doing. Overall, it's pretty simple. You get a group of those key leaders. They're not necessarily going to meet together a lot, but you have the mayors and the sheriffs and the county commissioners, the people that really have sway over helping you with the projects that you're doing. Then you get representation from 12 different sectors in the community. You assess, you start following the strategic prevention framework. You assess your community's needs, build their capacity, plan and implement something, and you have somebody that's going to help you keep this going. This is Shaylin's job, right? You have somebody who's there to kind of coordinate all of these efforts. And then you go through these 5 different phases where you build the group. The whole point of it is that collaboration. I looked up some different definitions of collaboration. Most of them are very similar. They're just different ways of saying the same thing, but I really liked this one the most. When a group of people work together to achieve a common goal by sharing their ideas, skills, and resources. That's not always easy. Some of you maybe even at some time have said this thing that I've said, which is, it would be easier for me to just do it myself. That way I know that it's going to get done. I know that it's going to get done the right way. And sometimes that works. For me, it worked for quite a while. But I've also seen this backfire. I'm guessing many of you probably have as well. Because at some point, my team had gotten so used to me just doing it that when there was that occasion that came up that was too big for me to handle, when I actually needed other people helping me, they weren't used to doing that. I was standing there alone. My team wasn't there to help me because I had never made them be. And that's why we really have to promote collaboration, even when we don't think it's necessary, because that is the whole point of a coalition. In fact, notice that there is no difference between those 2 words. The definition is the same. A coalition equals collaboration. And if that collaboration doesn't exist, we don't have a coalition. How many of you have ever been part of a meeting group? I've been a part of a meeting group. This is the definition of a meeting group, where people get together to listen to what somebody else is doing. Listen to how one person or one other person achieved a goal. I've been a part of a lot of meeting groups that I once thought were coalitions, but I eventually realized they weren't. They were just a group of people meeting together to talk about all the things that they were doing individually. It's the reason that I started with that clip from the Avengers. That's what these people were for a long time. They were a group of amazing individuals, each of them superheroes in their own right, each of them doing wonderful things to make the world a better place, and each of them missing the point. Each of them working super hard to put out the fires in front of them while the bigger danger still loomed in the background. And until they truly united their efforts, until they truly began to work together to achieve a common goal, they were not successful. This is our goal as people trying to create community change, as people trying to do health education and promotion and prevention. In order to be successful, we have to collaborate. We have to join forces and work together.
Collaborate.